Longtime lurker here, and I always contemplated telling my story. I feel like I am finally ready to revisit that time in my life. Maybe that is because my mother finally forgave herself. I was 10 years old, just started 5th grade. I made a new friend in school, Janie. My parents allowed me to go for a sleepover at her house. They met her mom once. My mom and dad were pretty laid back because I was their first kid. My sisters were 9 to 13 years older than me. So my mom dropped me off, said hello to Janie's mom, and left. Me and Janie started playing karaoke when her mom decided she was going to leave. She said goodbye to us, gave us kisses on the cheek, and I remember thinking she smelled like black licorice. Me and Janie were left to do whatever we wanted for the next 5 hours. Janie's older sister came home around 1 a.m. and told us that we should go to bed because we were falling asleep on the couch. So we went into Janie's room and laid in her bed. Later that night, I can't be sure what time because it was pitch dark, Janie's mom came home. I woke up to a pounding sound on Janie's bedroom door. I started yelling in fear when I felt a hand over my mouth. It was Janie telling me to be quiet and pretend to be asleep. But at the moment, it was too late. Her mom had kicked the door open, stormed over to the bed and grabbed Janie's face. She began screaming at Janie because we accidentally left the TV on. I was trying to hide under the covers, but she saw me. She began slamming her fist on the bed around me and screamed,
"You think you are better than me?"
over and over. I was sobbing, and all I could think about was going home. I was so scared, and I begged her mom to let me call my parents because I felt sick. Her mom grabbed my chin, looked me in the eyes and said,
"I know what you're doing, little girl, and you aren't going anywhere until I say you can."
She stormed out of the room, slamming the half-broken bedroom door behind her. Janie said nothing, and neither did I. Needless to say, I did not sleep that night. In the morning when I went to call my mom, Janie's mom was on the phone. She wouldn't let me use it, even though I asked multiple times. Finally, she was going to take a shower and I heard her pass the phone off to Janie's sister and say,
"Don't let that little bitch use my phone. If you do, I ain't buying you cigarettes anymore."
I was a sheltered kid at the time, but when I overheard that, I knew I had to get out of there. I approached Janie's sister and she basically threw the phone at me. She was ready to give it to me before I even asked for it. With a look of fear in her eyes, she said,
"My mom is calling her guy, so you need to call your home now."
And so I did. She saved my life, and I still believe that to this day. Was her guy someone who was going to get rid of me? Oh, I shudder at the thought. The rest of the story isn't very exciting. My mom picked me up. I acted like nothing was wrong. 2 days later, it was Parents' Day in school. Janie was in my class, which meant her mom was there. Her mom approached me and asked me why I never wanted to come over anymore, and accused me of being a mean girl. She talked to me in a way that seemed harmless, therefore wasn't obvious to my mom or my teacher. I kept my mouth shut and didn't say a word. Well, until 2 weeks later. My older sister was babysitting me while our parents were at the movies, and I broke down and told her what had happened because I couldn't stop thinking about it. She comforted me and told my parents. We hugged each other and we cried. A couple weeks later, Janie stopped coming to my school. My classmates wondered what happened, and so did I. I didn't want to ask my parents what happened. 15 years later, I heard from Janie on Facebook. There was no life-changing conversation, but we exchanged pleasantries. That's life sometimes. So crazy, alcoholic, abusive mother. Let's never meet again.
Prom night. The time that I grew up in is so much very different than times are now. With the world connected by the internet and cable television and cell phones, it seems like it's much more difficult to get away with bad things nowadays than it used to be. And if you want to use your imagination to know just how bad some of those things could be, you would likely be right on point. I grew up out in the country. I had a lot of relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins, second cousins. We all knew each other well. We were spread out in the tri-state area of West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. We didn't have a TV growing up, and it wouldn't have done us much good even if we did have one. There would have been no way that we would have been able to get any sort of reception. We did have radios, though, and that would be the main form of our entertainment and news at home. We also did not have a telephone. I remember sometimes my parents would get us in the car and take us to our cousin's house in town just so they could make a phone call somewhere. It's important to understand what things were like at this time, so this story will be more believable. I've told it to a lot of my younger relatives, and they don't believe it. But they think that things were always like they were today, but of course they were not. I used to hang out with my cousin Tommy a whole lot when we were growing up. We were pretty close in age. Not only that, but a lot of my cousins were girls, and we were the only two boys who were really close in age. So we were pretty close as we grew up, and we were typical country boy types growing up. We went camping, hunting, and fishing. It was Tommy who taught me how to shoot my first gun. We were 12 at the time, and his dad had bought him a gun. Like I mentioned, it's not something you would expect to happen much nowadays, but it was really not so unusual back then. We were friends from childhood, and would spend the summers pretty much all together. When we got into high school, Tommy developed his first real enemy. There was a boy named Brian, who was pretty popular in school. He was also a bit of a bully. Brian did a whole lot of crap, and he was always able to get away with it. The reason why was that Brian's second cousin was the county sheriff, and he came from a family that was long and deeply involved in the politics of the area. They were also quite well known for being very, very crooked. Most people would not want to cross anyone in the family for fear of ending up laying dead in the Ohio River, or something worse. Tommy wasn't the type to be afraid of anything, and he wasn't the type to stand down from anyone either. Naturally, a guy like Brian thought himself a sort of alpha wolf type of character, so he naturally hated it when anyone wasn't afraid of him. So he and Tommy had a lot of clashes, beginning in Tommy's freshman year. Things didn't get better as Tommy was a sophomore and a junior. He and Brian were always butting heads, but surprisingly enough, it had never gotten violent, and it remained that way until they were in their senior years. Now, for the life of me, I do not know what the two guys got into a fight over. I haven't the slightest. But it was during the outside period we had after lunch, and I was looking to find Tommy when people began running because there was a fight. And although I didn't know Tommy was involved in the fight at the time, I did hear that Brian was indeed one of the participants. Well, by the time I got over to the area that the fight was taking place in, it had reached its end, and I was surprised at what I was looking at. Tommy was standing over a bloodied Brian, who was yielding the fight. That was something that no one had ever seen before, and it brought an obvious overload of embarrassment onto Brian. He clearly told Tommy in front of everyone there, "I'm going to be the death of you someday." Well, I was scared. I think anyone in their right mind would have been, knowing the connections that Brian's family had. But Tommy wasn't worried. It didn't bug him at all. The rest of the school year went by normally. But on prom night, Tommy was supposed to drive over and pick me up, so we could then go and pick up our dates together. But he was late. I kept waiting for him to show up, but a couple hours passed by, and he never did. I mentioned before that we didn't have a phone, so I couldn't call him to see what was going on. I also couldn't bail on my prom date. My dad let me borrow the keys to his truck, and I went to pick up the girl I was seeing. Just as confused as I was, she insisted that we drive over to Tommy's house. When we got there, Tommy's parents were surprised to see me. I asked them if they had seen Tommy, and they told me he had left hours ago to go and pick me up for the prom. I let them know that he never showed up, and then we got very worried. We skipped the prom to go search for Tommy. Eventually we found his car. It was abandoned on the side of the road. After looking around in the area, we were unable to locate Tommy or any trace of him. There was nothing in the car to indicate that he was in an accident or anything like that. The car was parked and the keys were missing. We called the sheriff's office. Tommy didn't come home that night. He didn't come home over the weekend. We had no communication from him. The sheriff's office was unable to find anything, though they insisted that they had been intensely searching for him. I had my doubts. They eventually listed him as missing and quit actively trying to find him. Tommy didn't show up in the weeks leading into summertime. He didn't show up during the summer at all. We knew he didn't run away, because he would have taken his car with him if he had. Plus, he had no reason to. Although the sheriff's office insisted he probably just skipped town. In the early fall, I was sitting on the porch when I saw Tommy's car pull up the driveway. Since Tommy had been missing, his younger brother had been driving it. It was indeed his younger brother Travis who got out of the car, and he looked awful. I got up and ran over to Travis, calling to my parents as I did. He was white, and we had to take him and sit him down on the porch. When we did, he told us the most awful thing we had ever heard in our life. Their father had been out in the fields that day. He had smelled something dreadful and followed it to one of the scarecrows. The scarecrow smelled so unbelievably vile, and he wasn't sure why. So I felt around on it and realized it wasn't a scarecrow. Taking off his mask, he discovered a corpse within the clothes of the scarecrow. Underneath the scarecrow's outfit, it had on the clothing that Tommy was wearing on prom night. We knew what happened. We knew it had to do with Brian somehow. But when it was investigated by the sheriff, Brian's relative, they never solved it. Brian was never suspected by them. Surprise, surprise. Me, I knew better. I knew it was Brian, finally getting his retaliation for losing that fight to Tommy. The only happy ending this story could have is that Brian was stabbed in a bar fight less than a year later and died of the injury. And when the death was investigated, interestingly enough, no one in the bar knew who had stabbed him. Funny how things work. I grew up in urban areas, although the majority of my family lived in more rural areas. My parents had been raised in the country, but they really had no desire to remain in that sort of area. So after they got married, they moved quite a bit away from the rest of the family. However, we would visit our relatives several times a year. And during the summertime, I would very often spend the entire summer at my aunt's house. My aunt lived in one of those really country areas. You had to drive over an hour on dirt and gravel roads to get to our house. And even then, the houses were so spread out that you may have been within walking distance of the other houses, but it would have been a big walking distance. But I loved it. There were so many hills and forests and all sorts of places for me to explore. It was nothing like living in the city. I think the only thing I missed was the air conditioning, and even that wasn't the biggest deal to me when I was younger. My aunt's only child was a boy who was a year younger than me. He was more used to the area that he lived in and spent a lot of time outdoors. He went on little hikes as well, but he usually waited until I was around before going on any long hikes. Both of his parents worked, and so during the day in the summer, we were usually left to ourselves to find a way to be entertained. I was 12 years old the year that this story takes place. It was a hot, midsummer day. My cousin Joey and I were playing with G.I. Joe figures, and we were very bored. That's when we decided to go out exploring in the woods. We were allowed to do it, as long as we didn't venture very far off. However, this time, his parents would not be home for a very long time. So we decided that we'd go deeper into the forest than usual. We had a watch, so we would be able to get back home in time, and none would be the wiser. So we set off in the morning. It was so long ago, but I remember this time we went straight back from behind the house. There was a barbed wire fence that we had to get over, but this was not an obstacle for two boys who were on an adventure. It wasn't too long until we had left familiar territory. We were smart enough to bring a backpack with some drinks and snacks. We were dumb enough to have brought cans of Pepsi as opposed to bringing water. But hey, we didn't think about that sort of thing back then. As far as we knew, Pepsi was just as hydrating as water. I won't go into too much of the exploring because really that sort of thing is pretty boring if you're not there doing it. So I'll just go ahead and tell you about what happened to us out there. Well, we got lost. We didn't have a compass, and we wouldn't have known what to do with one even if we had one. We had traveled so far out that we didn't even have any familiar landmarks or any idea where we were. Our only plan was to try to keep walking in a straight line, hope that we came to a gravel road at some point, and use that to find our way back home. And that's when we came across something we didn't expect. It was an old cabin. Yes, cliché I know, but there really are old cabins out there. Small and a bit dilapidated. We didn't expect anyone to be there, but it looked like somebody was sitting out in the front of it on a chair. So we thought perhaps it was some old hermit or someone who might be able to help us find our way back to civilization. And yes, I realize asking a hermit to show you the way to civilization is very ironic, but we didn't know what else to do. As we approached closer and closer, we realized that it wasn't a person sitting in the chair. It was a scarecrow. I mean, it wasn't set up in a field to scare crows, but it was definitely a fake straw-filled man. It was just sitting in the chair. And then we heard a voice from inside the cabin. "Be right there, Horace." We were confused and beginning to get a little frightened. However, before we had a chance to react in any way, an old, smelly, and ragged old man came out of the small cabin. He was carrying 2 bowls of some sort of food. When he saw us, he almost dropped the food. "Are you bugging Horace?" he asked us, his voice quite angry. We assumed Horace was the scarecrow sitting in the chair. We denied that we were bugging him, and just told the man that we were trying to find our way out of the woods. The old man looked over at the scarecrow. He babbled some incoherent things at it before turning back to us. "That's not how Horace tells it." He scowled at us. "I'm getting my shotgun." The man turned to go back into the cabin. Joey and I didn't need an invitation to run away at that point. The two of us turned and booked it in the opposite direction of the cabin. We ran and we did not look back. When we heard a shotgun blast, we didn't look back. We just ran. Eventually, and by nightfall, we came across the dirt and gravel road that led to my aunt's house. We followed it to the house. My aunt had gotten home, and we told her that we had gotten lost. She said she was concerned, but it's easy to get lost in the woods around here. She was just happy that we had made it back. We told her about the strange old man and the scarecrow. She simply told us that there were some old hermits out in the hills, and it was best to do whatever you could to simply avoid them. That's why she didn't want us exploring too far away from the house. I'd like to tell you that we learned our lesson, and we didn't ever go back and get lost again. However, a talking scarecrow would be more believable than that.